Welcome back to part 2 of Irish Stew, live at the First Irish Festival. And I'm Martin Nutty.
And I'm John Lee. So let's head back upstairs at Ryan's daughter for our next guests, Northern Ireland actors John Duddy and Ciaran Byrne.
Big thank you to Origin Theatre for inviting us to do this. And we're joined by two wonderful guests, John Duddy and Ciaran Byrne. So please give them a big New York round of applause.
That's nice.
I'm delighted to be joined in the room by Ciaran Byrne, who is from Newry. Ciaran is from the foothills of the Mourne Mountains. Ciaran has a unique career profile. After leaving Northern Ireland and fetching up in New York, like many Irish people, he worked in construction as a plasterer. And interestingly, he decided to become an actor. And since then, he has gone on to have multiple credits on both TV and the silver screen. And so we're going to explore that interesting history. Please give a big round of applause to Ciaran Byrne.
And in this corner, he's known as Ireland's John Duddy, a.k.a. the Derry Destroyer. John was one of the most popular, charismatic, and successful Irish boxers, a huge fan favorite at Madison Square Garden, former IBA world middleweight title holder. Damn, that's good. Wow. He came to his good senses and retired from the ring in 2011. Gave up boxing for acting, has numerous stage and film credits to his name, and is the only one in this room who ever got a call from Robert De Niro offering him a role in an upcoming film.
Yeah.
John Duddy. I'm going to start off with a question for both of you. Former plasterer, former prize fighter, now actors. Does any of that past experience come into play when you're on the stage or in a film? Do you draw on that past experience?
For me personally, I think yes. What I loved about my first experience and all experiences going on a stage, it's really very similar to getting into a boxing ring because there's no safety net. You have to depend on your dedication, your hard work in the gym that you do before. And when you get on, you breathe, you let go and enjoy the ride. And acting has filled in that hole for me, which is probably one of the main reasons why I never ever went back to the boxing. It's not that it's easier, it's just as terrifying to say the stakes and learning your lines and things like that. But there's a freedom in walking out there and knowing that you're a part of this puzzle that helps tell this story. And usually you remember it when you leave it, whereas in the boxing, sometimes you didn't.
Is there like a sparring element with your fellow actors? Is there improvisation that happens even?
Sparring or the repetition, the over and over, how you can say the same word or same line and it changes every night.
Yeah.
And you can't mimic what you did the night before. It's because then people can tell that, like, whenever you get into it, and like, I don't know too much about it, but I know that whenever I'm stuck in my head, and that happened in boxing, if I was thinking, I was a second too slow. When you're not thinking and you trust the work that you've did leading up to it, and you just breathe and let go and know that you're going to land where you're supposed to because you've done the work.
Great.
So I'm going to ask.
Let's look at Ciaran in on that plasterer.
I want to, let's talk about that plasterer thing, because how do you go from plasterer to hitting the boards?
And what'd you learn there? What do you draw?
I started this in my middle 30s. The first play I ever saw in my life, I was about 33, and it was Philadelphia, Here I Come with the Irish Rep. I was living in Nantucket building houses for 6.5 years, and I just literally walked out of an Irish bar one night, saw a poster for an acting class hanging off a telephone pole on New Year's Day. It was like my fourth Christmas not getting home, and the class was 35, 40 minutes into session. They said it was only veteran actors, this wasn't for newcomers, so I walked in anyway, half in the bag, and they kept me, and I just devoured it, loved it, felt like I had a purpose, if you will, and I started going up and down to Boston and New York for acting classes and stuff, and then I was looking for Irish theatre, and this advertisement came up, and backstage that something was happening at the Irish Rep Philadelphia. Here I come. I remember going in with a headshot and a resume with nothing on the resume and a headshot against a red brick wall in the church in Nantucket. And I walked up to the box office and said to them, "My name's Ciaran Byrne and I'll be back here to work one day." And Jeffrey, who used to work there at the box office, says, "Of course you will, honey." But anyway, I did see the play and I did get back. But so that's how that happened then.
And your first gig was with the Irish Rep, am I correct?
My first professional gig in New York City was in a Larry Kerwin play called Blood at the Cell.
Which I saw.
Yeah, so that was like the first professional one. Then the Freedom of the City came after that. Ciaran and Charlotte had come to see Freedom of the City, and I went into an open call then for that. And interestingly enough, my first two plays were political plays. And
If I could jump in, because we had invited Larry to come tonight, but he's in Morocco. He'll be back for his reading tomorrow. Don't worry. But he said, ask Ciaran what it was like to play James Connolly in Blood. He said, Ciaran knocked it out of the park.
It's really hard for me, to be honest, to comment on things like that so close to home. I'm sure John can attest to this as well. It's because it's just us. It's just who we are. It's in our DNA. And there's not really a whole lot of planning goes into stuff like that, those kinds of roles. And you just show up and try to keep yourself together and tell a fair and impartial story to the best of your ability, whether they're shoes you walked in or shoes you didn't. And that's our job as theatre makers, is to not judge and try to walk a mile in other shoes. So it's a difficult one for me to comment on roles close to home. It's who we are and they get us.
And that's the Northern Irish context you're speaking of. There's people who are important in Northern Ireland. That's why it strikes close to home, that play.
It's everything we went through as young people in Northern Ireland, because Alicia mentioned post-conflict. John and myself are conflict. And so it's just who we are. My wife always says that when you're playing something close to home, you get that for free. It's like you don't have to put much into that. It's just you get that for free. And we get that for free, though it's not really for free. It's an ongoing cost. Yeah, anything close to home.
And speaking of conflict, we had the pleasure way back, maybe 3 years ago, of hosting Colin Broderick on the podcast, right when John's movie, where he's the lead role in that, A Bend in the River, came out. And in that podcast, Colin explained to us a little about your background and the conflict experience. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about your uncle, Jackie Duddy, because I think that is core, not just to your story, but your family's story, respectfully. But can you tell people maybe they don't know what the backstory is there?
Yeah. Jackie, my uncle, is called John Francis, and that's my name. That's my dad's brother. My dad was 11 years old when Bloody City happened, and that was a tragedy. But over through the years, and as I say, my uncles and aunties, much more experience than me to speak of, my uncle. But they kept fighting and they kept persevering and finally got the truth from the Brits that they were all innocent. And hopefully the city has been able to try and piece itself back together and move on, because it was a shadow over Derry as a kid growing up. And I wouldn't have been impressed on you, but my uncle still hangs in my father's wall in the living room. Like, it's always there. But they know that finally, I say unfortunately, there was many of their loved ones not here to hear that the Prime Minister came out and announced that they were all innocent and stuff. And that was our tragedy. And that tragedy was one of the main things that sort of blew up the troubles back home, which changed all our lives growing up. But again, my father was 11 when that happened. I was born 8 years later, which wasn't too much further after. But that's our history. That's a part of us. And as I say, just starting this, I was feeling emotional. But now that I've gone back on solid ground again, I'm proud of who I am, where I came from. And we've shown we will overcome. And I think that having that with us in our DNA, whatever struggles may be ahead, unfortunately, in the near future, we are going to overcome, because that's what we do. We're Irish.
Martin and I spent a week in Belfast back in the fall, and we talked to people from various sides and all different kinds of experience, but people who lived through it. And we were having a lot of fun, great times, great crack. And then there would be a moment of, you see the seriousness come on somebody's face.
Now, on the serious note, when you say the fall, are you talking about the fall or autumn?
The falls and the shankle.
So you're on about the fall or the falls?
In this case, I meant the fall made me off.
Yeah, I know that. Because it's kind of heavy. So got to keep it light in here.
Why don't you explain what you were referring to there?
Well, Belfast, there's two main areas in Belfast. You've got the Shankle and you've got the Falls, which would have been easy to get mixed up when someone was telling you we were there in the fall.
Yeah.
Speaking about the Troubles.
Yeah.
Did he just drop the S? Or was he there? He was there in autumn. I would just want to clear that up for everyone. Okay?
We were there in autumn, but we talked to people from both those areas.
From both areas. Good.
Yes. And we would see everybody was forward looking. Everybody was trying to get along. But then when they looked back, we'd be talking to them. Seriousness would come across them as they remembered something, they experienced something they saw.
Yeah.
And we were tremendously impressed by the sort of forward motion in Belfast, but there's something still there. And to get back to the theme of what we're talking about here, in your view, what can theater and the arts do to address this situation, address this mindset, move it forward?
In 30 seconds or less.
Yeah.
I didn't hear a bell.
It's a tricky one because I have two young daughters at home who were born and raised in New York City. And as they get older, they're learning more about me and where I came from and John's people and my people. And I think I was home at one point. I go home every year, but maybe about 10 or 15 years ago at one point I was home. And from some people, there was almost like an ambivalence around that time. And it upset me greatly. Because while it's certainly not good to harbour things and hold on to things, particularly that kind of trauma, which didn't necessarily feel like trauma at the time because we were all living it. It was everybody's daily life. So it wasn't trauma, it was great. I thought I had a great childhood until I started going to therapy here. They're like, no, dude. No, dude, you did not have a great childhood. I still think I had a great childhood. Everybody got on with it. Everybody enjoyed the crack and how are you doing and just made the best of it. But it's important to not hang on to the past. I think it's important that it's taught, and that people remember it, and that people remember the likes of John's uncle, Jackie, and the other almost 4,000 people that lost their lives during this period of time from like 1960. And people only talk about like really from 1969 to 1994, 1998, but people were still dying after that, but it wasn't making news headlines anymore. That sort of moved on and it was in smaller things. I think I'm getting lost on the question, but I think it's important that as theatre makers that we affect positive change and we teach and we try to move the needle forward in whatever modest way that we can. I think to a certain degree, certainly not like firefighters and armed services and stuff, but I think to a certain degree, theatre workers have an essential responsibility. And I think we are, to a degree, essential artisans. It's their job to affect some kind of positive change in humanity wherever we can. So I guess.
Do you see it the same way, John? Or
Yeah, as I say, living in New York, I've been lucky to look back at home, sort of get out of the bubble. Because when we grew up on it, we were all the same. And that's funny, getting out of the north, even just going down to Dublin, they have no clue what you're living through. And when you went to England, you realised that they don't hate us. Yeah. And that's wow. Yeah. But in that bubble that we were in, and then coming to New York, that's what I love about New York. Like you're meeting everybody from all walks of life, all nationalities, religions, colours, languages. And we seem to find a way to make it work. And I think what he was talking about, learning from history, and I've been lucky enough to be able to be at readings where there was guys that were involved in the Troubles that were in prison. And how they first got in there in the first place wasn't necessarily they wanted to be a gunman or something like that, but they got mixed up in it, and to be able to hear that story, it's never black and white. There's no good side. It's all wrong. And unfortunately, our people grew up and we were kind of like, looking back, I feel personally that we were like an experiment. We were like an experiment where somebody was dictating and poking, and just as long as they're killing each other, then it doesn't matter. And then they get out, when you get out of that bubble and you meet people that lived on that other side of the street, but you're in New York and you don't have that divide no more, and you realise, oh, we're actually the same. You just go to that church here and I go to that one, and
or
that sounds funny.
Used to go.
Do you know what I mean? But wow, that was the only separate. And they get out of that, and that's what I think so beautiful about theatre is that what happens behind closed doors, is actually the exact same thing from one side. Like, it was only a small divide. But what I always found fascinating about home is Derry, you have the River Foyle, so you have the Derry side, and then you have like the Protestant side. Whereas in Belfast, you have the Protestants, you have the Catholics, and they all lived on top of each other. So that was a new experience for me when I would go up visiting as well. And they see that now all of a sudden, where they can see their neighbour, and like with theatre, seeing like the first play I seen in New York was Night November. Changed my life. My dad told me about it. And then the first time I was in the Irish Arts Centre was this show. Marty McGuire was the lead on it. And it was the story about the rising sun, where the guys came on. And it was there was a Republic of Ireland was playing Northern Ireland in the soccer. And when Republic of Ireland scored, fans started shouting trick or treat. But they see this play from the Protestants' point of view, and how they get caught up on it, and they end up having a breakdown, and they go to Dublin and they jump on a flight and they come to New York, they support the Republic of Ireland team. How weird was that? But it was just amazing. And the fact that my dad experienced that in Derry at the Rialto, and I was in the Irish Arts Centre here in New York going, oh my God, wow, I never knew that. And getting out of that bubble of home, like in that story, when he comes to the 94 football World Cup. I'm in New York, I'm an American too now. But they see that there, and they're coming from the Protestant side of the community, and you're realising, oh my God, they're just like us. They're in trauma. There's no good guy, there's no bad guy, there's certainly a lot of evil there, and manipulated by all their powers that be, and we all knuckled down and found our way to try and get out of it. Yeah. And art's a great way of doing it, and not getting black eyes. I decided to go boxing. Go figure. But they have them experiences years later. Yeah. And as Ciaran says, learning the history, not pushing it under the rug, not hiding it away. Like, with the same troubles in this country as we do back in our country now, and religion and stuff like that there, but there is good. There's good there. It's not all nightmares and traumas and stuff like that, but we have to learn from them mistakes to realise we got to protect these people. We got to find a way of giving people a voice. Just the first two speakers were talking about having people come in and having a conversation. It's about the same topic, but it might be from a different point of view. That's theatre. Yeah. It's beautiful.
Yep. Yeah, I think theatre gives the opportunity to explore the other person's experience, which is a really important thing when we come to understand each other as people. But while John will often remark that I like to probe the misery of Irish history and depressing stories, and I grew up, of course, in Ireland in the south, only 90 miles away from north of Ireland, but literally I knew nothing of the place. And my first trip to Northern Ireland, actually to Belfast, was only in October. And so it was a world away from me, even though it was only 90 miles away from where I grew up. The one thing that I was struck by on the trip into Belfast was the warmth of people. And in addition to that, the extraordinary sense of humour that I think is a response to a lot of the stuff that was going on around to us. And of course, we all are familiar with the phenomenon that was the Derry girls and that extraordinary humour that comes across in that. And I think talking to people in Belfast and talking to people from Derry, I see that playing out. And I'm just wondering, does that inform your experience, the ability to be able to make fun constantly, to go to comedy? And is that what makes actors out of Northern Ireland good? And I'm not going to look at you while I'm asking this question. I'm going to go to Ciaran. So taking that big, long-winded question, comedy, pain, and the relationship with Northern Ireland, does that make you a better actor? Are you influenced by that?
I don't know that it makes you a better actor, but it's certainly been a coping mechanism for Irish people all throughout the ages. And I think maybe it's actually more interesting, if you want to talk about it from an acting perspective, maybe from an audience's perspective, is it's much more interesting looking at someone who's trying to find the hope. My wife always says, she's an acting coach, and she'd say, play the hope and we'll feel the loss. So if you're out there having a bit of crack and having a laugh and trying to find ways to have a laugh, it just makes you a more magnetic person to be around, as opposed to someone who's wallowing in the stuff that we all know happens. So I think humor's It's a great mechanism for theatre. I don't know that it makes us better actors, but it probably makes us easier to watch and listen to for making people laugh. Nobody wants to hear about death and destruction all day long, but make somebody laugh, and it's good tonic.
There's a lot of dark humor in those topics. I think the Irish are notoriously famous for it, around the Irish wake.
Yeah, I did want to comment on something that John just mentioned there now. It was a night in November, and I've stayed away from that play for 30 years. I wouldn't watch it. I remember it vividly happening at home, being incredibly confused by the whole thing. And I've always seen myself as an Irishman. I say I'm a Northern Irishman. Some people say they're from the north of Ireland. Some people think if you say it's from the north of Ireland, it's more Irish than if you're Northern. And Catholics say Northern and all this stuff. And I'm like, good Jesus, I'm an Irishman. Like that's it. And so to sit and watch this play 30 years later out at the Irish Centre, I did find it wildly healing. I was sitting there and I was in tears for most of it, for the hour and a half or whatever it was that went on. But it wasn't tears of upset. I couldn't really put my finger on it because I wasn't upset, and I wasn't, at least I didn't think I was, but there was just some kind of release happening, that I was getting to see this play out in front of me. And yeah, I just bring it up because John mentioned A Night in November. I experienced some kind of catharsis, if you will, myself in the theatre that night, experiencing this man telling this story about something which was just an incredibly confusing thing as a young person to watch, and quite an ugly event, to be quite blunt about it. Yeah.
What's the psychological strain or stress of taking on roles that nightly drag you through a trauma or a crisis? If you put yourself into it, can you shake it off afterwards? Or
I wouldn't be experienced enough to dwell on that. I don't know if I've got the vocabulary for it, but I think since leaving home, I don't think trauma or growing up where we grew up makes you a good actor or whatnot, but it certainly gives you somewhere to go and depth and tools if you're courageous enough to do it. And like, we all have similarities, and that's one thing that you find, whether it's in Northern Ireland or anywhere else in the world where there's conflict, like that, you've got something similar with that person on the other side of the fence. And I just find it, as in my whole life, I never knew I had trauma. It's wow. How I grew up wasn't normal.
when we had Colin Broderick on, and we talked a lot about your film you did with him, he has this point where he goes, like, and we thought it was normal.
Yeah.
And it's not.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The way he grew up.
Yeah. It was made, but not made normal. You have to, that's what's so great about Derry Girls, which, again, as Lisa mentioned, was based on her school. And I can say my lovely wife, Grania, and here it was her school as well.
There we go.
So it was, and it was Lisa McGee who wrote it. It's her school, so it was the best school in Derry. And I'm married to one of the girls from that school.
Yeah, baby.
But seeing that show, I remember when I first seen it over here, and of course when people start seeing themselves at the beginning, I remember my dad going, "We don't sound like that. Like, we don't go on like that, John. We don't." And I'm like, yeah. I'm sorry to tell you about it. And again, because I'm probably outside of it a little bit, and and again, it took me a while when you're watching it going, are we really that bad? And then you catch yourself saying it and moving it, and then some of the stories and the aunties and how the first episode, the auntie's wondering if the bomb scare will be over in time so she can go get tear tan and so on. I'm like, yeah. I remember collecting Grania from Marks and Spencer's, the superstore, in the car park, because that's where you went when there was a bomb scare. And it was right beside the centre where the bomb was supposed to be. And whenever we get there, she sees the manager and says, my shift's over in 45 minutes. Can I get my handbag tomorrow? And me and Joe, no problem, Grania, she'll see you tomorrow. And it was normal, but it was a bomb scare. Yeah. And there was police and Brits everywhere, and they see it on TV and go, holy, yeah, wow, I forgot about that. Yeah. You know, and the humour of that show, and it's all in the backdrop. It's not about the troubles. The troubles was there, and this is just regular, everyday people trying to go on with their life. And Colin did another movie called Emerald City, and he has a great story where he's telling this girl, Rachel, who ends up in real life as his wife now, and he talks about how it didn't feel like it happened. You went around, he says, you went to school, you tried to date the girl, you tried to get the job. He says, we It was normal. You didn't go around, oh, is this going? You were living as normal as could be.
Yeah.
And it's not then until we left it where you look back and you're scratching your head going, wow, that wasn't really normal at all. Yeah. And you can't look, I don't know, I've never taken myself serious. I used to tell people I get punched in the head for a living when I was here but they used to look at me like I was crazy. I'm like, I'm a professional boxer. Because if I says I was a professional boxer at home, people would be like, going, oh, he's getting too big for his bits.
There you go.
You always keep it in a, do you know what I mean? You always keep it in a low. And no, humour, that's how we, I don't think we had a choice. That's how you move on. And I think I'm in a room surrounded with people that are amazing at doing it. Yeah. So
I just wanted to weigh in on something that John was the question there with John before that, taking you off script again. That's for all the jokes.
No script.
That's for all the teasing at the beginning.
I can't remember the script. This is great.
So I think you asked a question about roles that are very close to home and the trauma. So obviously playing James Connolly had its own that, and the Father Daly-like figure in Brian Friel's Freedom of the City had its own thing. But I bring it up only to share that I was lucky enough a couple of years ago that John got to do a reading of a play on stage with John here, who's one of my favourite actors on earth to work with. If you want the truth, get on stage with John Duddy. That's what's going to happen. So it was a play called 5 Minutes of Heaven, and it was just a reading, and it was based on the movie that Liam Neeson and James Nesbitt was in about the man that shot the kid's brother when he was young and went away to prison and came out and tried to preach and teach healing all over the world in conflicted zones and stuff. And I mention it because I was very solitary in the Freedom of the City in terms of my experience, because no one had went through that. And I was playing, as I say, this Father Daly type character who tried to save everybody on the day of Bloody Sunday, with James Connolly obviously as well. So you had this process that you went through every day, and this like unburdening at the end of the night that hopefully would be shed from you before you go on stage the next night. But it was a solitary process because I was doing the plays with all Americans. Mostly, and people from the South who didn't necessarily go through that.
Free staters.
I hesitate to call them that because you get into all sorts of trouble when you say things like that, especially for me. But with John and I on stage, even though, and it was at Irish Rep, again, it was for Origin, and Ciaran and Charlotte let us do it at Irish Rep like that. We worked on that for one day. And the night that we were there, I can't speak for John, obviously, and I won't, but what started as one thing became something entirely other on stage as it was happening. This is something that John and I both went through at the same time, and we're on stage at the same time reading this play. And it took me about 10 days to be able to come back out into the public after that. And it was one reading that lasted 90 minutes on stage. There's something that happened to me doing that with John that never happened in anything else that we've done 70, 80, 90, 100 performances of. In that one reading, when you're standing on stage telling your truth with a man who lived the same thing, it does something much, much different. To your point in the question you asked, does it have that? That did, more than any of the other prepared roles.
What struck me about what you said is that your experience with John on the stage is different than any other actor. So talk to us about that.
For me, I was starting, to use an analogy that John is familiar with, I was starting toe-to-toe with someone who had experienced the same things growing up in the same area as I did. And now we're relaying a story to a room full of people who are hearing this for the first time. And it's no longer acting. At some point during that reading, it stopped. And I could see, looking across at John and John looking across at me, that I felt we'd crossed into another realm. And that's not something that happens every day. And that was that was the most meaningful experience that I've ever had on a stage, because I felt it, all of it. And it was just us together. There were other people in the play, but we were the ones that went through that. And you can't fake that. You can't act. That's just what it is. That's two people with 100 years combined. Yeah, and their families, and that transcends art. That's something else.
Does it strike you that way, John?
I think, yeah, it's like it was discovering something I never knew was there. Basically, all of a sudden unveiling something that you didn't recognize was there. And there's a lot of talented people everywhere, and for some reason there's something that maybe hides it or shelters it and stuff like that. I've been lucky to be sitting in this room with people that I respect and admire, and standing on that stage with Ciaran as well. and they look at it again. It's a reading. It hits you and affects you in a certain way that you weren't quite expecting. And I don't know, it was thrilling, it was terrifying, it was everything that you wanted to be, maybe more. But yeah, it was like going 12 rounds in Madison Square Garden to some extent. For me, I'm blown away with them bringing it up. But I remember I did a reading with Licia as well about the hunger striker in the Irish Arts Centre. And I remember us having a conversation, and there was one of the other readers was from was it Zimbabwe or somewhere?
Yeah, Majita.
And we started having a conversation about what this story was. And she lives in Zimbabwe, and I live in Northern Ireland, and all the other actors. And it was amazing the commonality that we had and what we grew up, the similarities and what we grew up in, the trauma, and how we're sitting in New York City in a wee change room before going out going, how would we have ever found this out in common with each other and with this piece of work?
Yep.
And that's, for me, a release. That's something, or an unveiling, or getting to know yourself. And if that's just for us, the actors, what's the listeners experiencing? And is that not the whole point? Take people on a journey. Get people forgetting about whatever's going on outside for an hour, 10 minutes, 30, whatever length of time. But I find it fascinating how you can be on stage with someone who you don't know or where they come from, and you find this similarities that are just totally undeniable. And it's quite beautiful.
Yeah, that was a play called Those You Pass on the Street by, interestingly enough, by a hunger striker called Lawrence McKeown. And it was commissioned by Kibosh Theatre, Paula McFettridge, and that out of Belfast. And they kindly let us do it at the Irish Arts Centre, again, with Origin. And that was with Ciaran and John and that as well. Yeah, so that was just funny. It was written by a hunger striker.
It's fantastic you're talking to a professional, because I don't know any of that.
No.
He's a plaster.
But the experience of it is like second to none. I've had a lot of experiences, very lucky, but reading paper on a stage with these people is life-changing.
So unfortunately, we're getting to that point.
It's the music playing. The music's
We'll roll that in. We'll roll in.
The hook is not coming out.
Which
but
one?
That wasn't quite the hook I was thinking of, but I'll go with that. But let's talk about upcomings. So
What's next?
your chance to give a shout out about what you're doing. So I'll let John go first, and then we'll follow up with Ciaran. What should we look for?
Hopefully later this year there'll be a movie somewhere, whether it's in a cinema or on a streaming app or something, called Angel of the North. It is about a fighter, a bare knuckle fighter who was born in Omagh, raised in Newcastle. His name's James Gypsy Boy McCrory. And we shot it 2 years ago. I actually just finished doing the ADR work about 2 weeks ago. They've been editing it together, and hopefully this year at some stage it'll be on a cinema or TV screen near you, which I'm looking forward to. Plus, he was born in Omagh.
Yeah.
He grew up in Newcastle. So I'm going to get some abuse about the accent. So I'm looking forward to it.
It is what you say it is.
I'm looking for work if anyone's hiring.
There we go.
I actually just, I'm working on, no, I can't say. I'm looking for work if anybody's hiring.
But there is something going on.
Something in the
I just
pipeline.
realized I almost said it. And I'm like, not allowed.
All right. I love it.
Okay, so with that mystery commentary, we'll all be stalking Ciaran Byrne on the internet now and see if he's left other breadcrumb clues across the interwebs. But on behalf of John and myself and all the wonderful people that have been here this evening, we'd like to thank you for giving us an insight into your experience on the stage and the backstory of your life and what makes you both such incredibly accomplished performers. So big round, and thank you so much.
So that's a wrap of our first Irish Stew Live at the First Irish Festival. Our thanks to our guests, to Mick Malamphy, actor extraordinaire and artistic director of the Origin Theatre Company, for all his guidance on this project and for making ours the first podcast to be included in First Irish. We much appreciate the support of the Northern Ireland Bureau for making this evening possible. And our thanks to Jimmy, Sebastian, and Derek of Ryan's Daughter for their warm welcome and assistance. And of course, massive thanks to our enthusiastic audience and to you for being part of our global Irish Nation conversation. Please join us again next week here on Irish Stew.
Irish Stew is produced by John Lee, Martin Nutty, and Bill Schultz. Editing, mixing, and mastering by Bill Schultz. Music on Irish Stew was composed and performed by Rosa Nutty, with Donald Bowens on drums, Cathal O'Riordan on bass and synthesizer. For more on Rosa Nutty's music, please visit rosanutty.com.